Hello there, I'm Carmilla and guess what, bitch? This is Ticket Stubs. I saw some horror films and I want to talk about them today. The first film I want to talk about is an Argentinian horror film called When Evil Lurks. This is a story of demonic possession from the director of 2017's Aterrados, or Terrified, which is a film I've never been able to get all the way through, but has some pretty great moments. And this film has quite a bit of buzz surrounding it. It's a bona fide beehive, bitch, hitting you with them plosives. I thought this film started out quite promising, but unfortunately I just can't say that I liked it. It takes an interesting approach to the demonic possession storyline. Essentially, it starts at the end of a possession which triggers an epidemic of demonic possessions across a small farming community. From the opening, the film is quite well shot, and the presentation in general is probably my favorite thing about it. It looks very clean and professional, and there's a lot of dynamic camera movement and well-coordinated scenes. The opening is incredibly evocative and graphic, and it wastes no time getting into some very nasty horror. The director, Demian Rugna, has a terrific grasp of the shocking and the grotesque, and there's a lot of fantastic horror imagery sprinkled throughout the film. It's pretty obvious to me that this film is working so well with horror audiences because it does not pull its punches at all. If you find yourself frustrated with mostly American horror films that are too spineless to put child characters in any sort of peril, then this will certainly be a refreshing experience, to say the least. And if you're one of those people who acted like Damien Leone actually killed a child for the 1-minute teaser of Terrifier 3, then you should probably skip this one. And also, take an edible or something. Calm down. But back to When Evil Lurks, as much as I appreciate Demian Rugna's willingness to kill off child characters in horrific ways, it almost goes a little too far here. And I don't mean in an offensive way, I just mean that it almost becomes predictable. If there's a young child in a scene, there's a 95% chance that that child will be dead by the end of the scene. And there is an attempted thematic justification for this, but it literally just comes down to a character saying, "Children like evil, and evil likes children." And I said, what? And that brings me to my biggest criticism of this film, which is that the story is it's a mess, y'all. It's just constantly throwing all these new rules into the mix to see what sticks. So it's nearly impossible to get invested in the world of the film beyond just a visual standpoint. It's atmospheric and it looks pretty, but it's absolutely fucking impossible to follow the rules of possession in this world. The two main characters have never dealt with this before, so they constantly have people who know what's going on telling them that what they've done earlier in the film was breaking a rule and it was stupid of them, and now they're all gonna suffer because of it. It happens so often that somebody says, "You did this innocuous thing, you fucking idiot," and then I'm sitting there watching well, I didn't know they weren't supposed to do that. Does that make me an idiot that I can't follow your convoluted ass rules that I wasn't even told in the first place? And I think it's probably going for something like, ooh, don't mess with things you don't understand because you might make things worse unintentionally. But the frequency with which this kind of thing happened made it feel more like Demian Rugna was just making it up as he went along. The funniest instance of this is a scene in a car where the grandmother character sings the children a folk song about these demons, and I would bet actual money that the actress was just coming up with the lyrics and the melody on the spot. It was very, very funny. And unfortunately, making it up on the spot is a lot of how this film feels, even if that's not the case. To me, it genuinely felt like one of those instances where a director had a great idea for the beginning and a great idea for the ending, and had a few really shocking set pieces they wanted to throw in there, but didn't really know how to tie it all together in the middle. And I wouldn't really mind all the nonsense if it was interesting nonsense. I mean, for fuck's sake, last episode I spent 10 minutes gushing about the Saw films, and those are 100% nonsense. But this film tries to deliver an emotional, character-driven story in between all the horror set pieces, and it fails because it doesn't do any of the legwork required to make these characters interesting. It starts with the possession stuff from the very opening of the film, so we never really get to see any of these characters' relationships outside of this event, so we don't get to see how they change, how they're strained. There are many scenes of impassioned discussions between characters, but because we don't really know anything about these people, we have no reason to get invested in their relationships. I actually watched this film twice twice because the day after my first viewing, I literally could remember nothing except for the few very shocking moments. So when I watched it again, I realized that the reason I couldn't remember anything was because 90% of this movie is an incomprehensible plot driven by extremely boring characters. I do understand why people are praising this film, because the way the horror set pieces are presented is really unique and effective. It's the kind of film where shocking events happen with little to no build-up, which is kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it does create this sense throughout the entire film that anything can happen at any moment, and that can make for an edge-of-your-seat experience for some people. But for me personally, the adrenaline of a shocking scene wears off fairly quick, and then I'm just sort of waiting for the next scare. So that sort of thing really only works for me in an extremely fast-paced movie where stuff is constantly happening and getting more chaotic. Think Darren Aronofsky's Mother, for instance. Yeah, get fucked, I love that film, and I won't hear any slander about it on my channel, no sir. But in the case of When Evil Lurks, there is so much time between scares that I just was bored for the vast majority of it. And it doesn't help that in a couple of these shocking scenes there's some CGI that didn't really work and kinda took me out of the experience a little bit. There's one other thing that I want to mention, but it is slightly spoilery, so if you don't want to hear any spoilers for this film, then skip to this point in the video. So the oldest child character is nonverbal autistic, and I'm not really sure how I feel about this representation, to be honest. Throughout the film he's pretty much just staring out the window of the car and not speaking, and towards the end of the film it's revealed that he actually is possessed. But he's not showing any signs of possession, and the reason for that is apparently because demons can't figure out the autistic brain, so they become trapped and unable to actually possess the person. Now, I've never been diagnosed as autistic. I would not be surprised if I'm on the spectrum, but clearly I'm not nonverbal, so I can't really speak to this representation. It felt at the very least notable to me. I can't really pinpoint how I feel about it. It's an interesting idea, but I would really like to hear what neurodivergent people have to say on the topic. So if you're neurodivergent and you saw this film and you had thoughts about the autistic representation, please get in touch. I'm very curious. Alright, I've talked about this film enough, so overall I thought the beginning and ending were pretty great. It's really well shot and there's some great scenes here and there, but unfortunately I didn't really feel that the pros outweighed the cons on this one. I'd say if you're a horror fan, and especially if you're a gore fan, it's worth a watch, but don't expect a masterpiece. I do still think this director shows a lot of promise, and I'll be watching whatever he does next, but as for When Evil Lurks, I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 10. Alright, The Exorcist Believer. Here we go. The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin and based on the superb novel by William Peter Blatty, is one of the most respected horror films of all time, and why am I even telling you this? You know this already. It took me several years, 3 viewings, and a reading of the novel to truly love The Exorcist, but I've since come to hold both the book and the film in extremely high regard, which is quite the achievement when you consider that William Peter Blatty and I are pretty much opposites on the political and ideological spectrum. At times I even felt like the novel was just projecting his fear of people like me onto the American parent. But it's such a heartfelt and lyrically well-written novel that I was able to reach a rare place of respect for his faith. That is until he lost his fucking mind entirely and started promoting quote-unquote documentaries made by conspiracy theorists with a knack for committing felonies. You know, I do have a point here beyond just dragging a dead man's name through the mud, and that point is that The Exorcist, no matter how you slice it, is a deeply conservative story. And that's something that any modern incarnation is going to have to grapple with. It's a tightrope that's difficult to walk these days. How do you stay true to source material that's so fundamentally conservative without alienating the large amount of not very conservative horror viewers today? And just to nip this in the bud right now, if you're about to go into the comments to tell me to keep politics out of my reviews, then I would advise you to fuck off, go read The Exorcist again, and then come back to me and try to make an argument about why The Exorcist is not political. My whole point here is that it's fucking hard to make a sequel to The Exorcist. I mean, they only did it right once. But there is a lot you could do with a modern incarnation of it. Engage with the original text in a way that's both critical and respectful. Go in a completely different direction, like The Exorcist 3. Revisit Regan and Chris later in life. Make it a movie about confronting childhood trauma. You could do any of these things if your name wasn't David Gordon Green. DGG and his cronies were kind enough to give us the recent Halloween reboot trilogy, which started off pretty promising and then ended so bafflingly terribly that I kinda almost liked it. Halloween Ends is honestly a masterclass in creating the least satisfying ending to a trilogy you possibly can, and coming off of that rousing success, he decided to give us a new Exorcist trilogy, starting with The Exorcist Believer. And the one positive thing that I can say about this film is that at least it doesn't give us false hope for the rest of the trilogy. Okay, there's actually two more positive things that I can say about this film. The first is that the Tubular Bells theme is used pretty well only in one scene. It's not overused, so that's good, and I thought its usage in the film was pretty appropriate. And the other thing is that Leslie Odom Jr. is incredibly sexy as a single father. Apart from that, though, hoo boy, is The Exorcist Believer one steaming pile of shit. I honestly don't know where to begin, because this movie doesn't do a single thing right. I suppose the first act is fine for the most part. The medical examination scene I thought was quite well handled. There's really not much to say. The first half of this film is just a badly paced, truncated version of the first half of the original, but instead of just following Chris McNeil, we follow a single father and another family, because there's two possessed girls this time. And needless to say, it doesn't work nearly as well as the first film because it doesn't have the patience of the first film. The original is concerned with convincing you, the viewer, that something supernatural is happening. It spends the majority of its runtime debunking all of the scientific and medical explanations for what's happening to Regan one by one. Your desperation grows along with Chris McNeil's to the point where you genuinely feel that the only thing that can save this girl is faith. But this is 2023, and we've all seen The Exorcist, so we know that there's really a demon doing it. But the film still needs to convince its characters that what's going on is possession, and it happens inorganically, very rushed, and it doesn't work at all. You know, I'm just now realizing that I can't really talk about why this movie is as bad as it is without just having a full-on spoiler discussion, so the rest of this is just gonna be a spoiler discussion. So skip to this point in the video if you don't want to hear spoilers for Exorcist Believer, although I will say that hearing these spoilers might warn you off of watching the actual movie. So the film opens in Haiti with a shot of dogs fighting, just like the opening of the original in Iraq with the dogs fighting. And Leslie Odom Jr. and his super pregnant wife are on vacation, I think. He's a photographer and he's just kind of chilling, taking pictures of Haitian children, and she gets a blessing for her unborn baby by this healer woman. And because they're in Haiti, an earthquake hits, which gravely injures his wife, and he is told by the doctors that he can either save her or the baby, but not both. And then right before we see who he chooses, it jumps forward 13 years, and he's a single father, and he has a daughter, so we're like, okay, you chose the baby. And then his daughter Angela and her friend Catherine sneak off into the woods to do a seance so that Angela can, like, talk to her mom's ghost. And then the two girls go missing and turn up 3 days later. And because all of this is shown in the trailer, and obviously they're going to show up because there wouldn't be a movie without them, I kind of assumed that the film wouldn't spend too long on the section where they're missing, but god does it take forever. We're introduced to Catherine's family, which is pretty much the most cliched white Christian family you could possibly imagine, and for whatever reason they treat Leslie Odom Jr. like he's a super irresponsible father, even though he is exactly as culpable in the disappearance as they are. So not only are they a typical conservative white Christian family, but they're also racists, and that's pretty much all the level of characterization we get with them. There's also a bizarre scene in this segment where Leslie Odom Jr. goes to a soup kitchen to ask the homeless people if they have any information about the missing girls, and one of the ones he talks to starts like laughing and making jokes about them basically being R-worded, and the guy's literally like making gestures with a hot dog. And then Leslie Odom Jr. gets so upset that he flips the table, which I guess is a warranted reaction, but like flipping a table on homeless people in a soup kitchen is kind of a dick move. And then there's a point where he comes home and the front door's open and there's clearly someone in his daughter's room, and I was like, oh, thank God we're finally done with this portion of the movie. But no, they're still missing. And what's happening now is that Leslie Odom Jr.'s friend, who is this white guy who's like into new age spiritual stuff, has invited a bunch of root workers to come over and like burn sage in her room and bless her room. And understandably, Leslie Odom Jr. is like, what the fuck are you doing? I didn't ask you to do this. My daughter's missing. Get the fuck out of my house. But finally the girls do turn up in a barn that's like 30 miles away, and they're taken to the hospital, and pretty much immediately after being discharged they start behaving in ways that Regan was in like the last half hour of the original movie. Angela wets the bed at home and then attacks her dad, and Catherine has this hilarious outburst in church where she drinks all the sacrament wine and eats a bunch of the wafers, and then she walks down the center aisle repeating the body in the blood over and over again and getting louder. And I'm pretty sure that in post-production they sped up her voice just a little bit. It was not scary and I did laugh. So they check Angela back into the hospital, and Catherine's mom immediately is like, I think they went to hell and brought a demon back with them. And Leslie Odom Jr. just kind of stares at her. But then Ann Dowd, who's the nurse taking care of Angela and also conveniently their next door neighbor, Angela starts making cryptic references to her past. Essentially, she was going to become a nun, and then she was like, you know what, before I do that, I want to have sex. And she got pregnant and then had an abortion, and she was like, I'm not going to be a nun anymore. And so Angela refers to her by the name she would have chosen as a nun, and then is like, how's your baby, or something like that. And then she notices scratched into Angela's body the words, help me. If you don't recall, in the original, the words help me appearing on Regan's body are what spur Father Karras to actually go through with the exorcism. And it's at this point in The Exorcist Believer that Ellen Burstyn is reintroduced, and also the point where it goes from a bad film to a fucking train wreck. Ann Dowd goes to Leslie Odom Jr. and she's like, hey, I know you don't believe in God or anything, but this just happened and I think you should read this book. And the book she hands him is called A Mother's Explanation by Chris MacNeil. Yes, that's right, Chris from The Exorcist has written a tell-all book about Regan's possession, which we learn has resulted in Regan cutting her off completely and going into hiding. Bravo, David. It's bad enough that this movie posits that Chris MacNeil would ever do something like sell out and write a book about that experience. But when Leslie Odom Jr. actually decides to read it, what changes his mind is seeing that the words help me appeared on Regan's body just like Angela's. Something Chris MacNeil was not present for in the original film or book and is explicitly not made aware of it. It is entirely possible that someone could have mentioned that after the fact. I have no problem imagining that that's probably what happened, but the fact that it isn't even mentioned that she wasn't aware of it at the time feels like no one working on this movie has any actual affection or respect for the original. But that's just the tip of the iceberg with Chris MacNeil in this film. Leslie Odom Jr. reads her book and then goes to talk with her, and she's like, you know, I didn't actually do the exorcism, right? And then there's a weird moment where she's like, oh yeah, they didn't let me in the room because of misogyny. And listen, I know that misogyny runs deep in the Catholic Church, but at that moment I was like, you sure about that? You sure about that that's the reason why? Did you really want to be in that room having your 12-year-old daughter tell you to suck dick and cock in hell? Had nothing to do with the danger that you would have been put in? You know, the danger that killed the 2 priests who kept you out because of misogyny? Is this really the only thing you want to criticize the original for not being woke about? Meanwhile, the film's still treating Ann Dowd's abortion like the worst possible thing she could have done. I know this is a nitpick, but do you see what I mean about how little these filmmakers actually seem to understand the original film? But anyway, the gist of their conversation is that Chris MacNeil is like, well, I spent a lot of time researching exorcisms, but I'm still not an exorcist myself. But sure, why not? I'll come back with you and try to help. And I'm about to tell you what happens next, but let me preface it by saying that I am not making this up. This actually happens in the film, and it's played dead straight. At this point, we learn that Catherine is not in the hospital. For whatever reason, they decided to keep her at home with all of her younger siblings, even though they think that she's possessed by a demon. So So Leslie Odom Jr. and Chris McNeil show up, and the house is trashed, and at this point I was like, holy shit, is she going to have killed her whole family? That would be awesome. But no, they're all still alive and just huddled in the kitchen praying. Chris goes up the stairs and into Catherine's bedroom, and I swear to God, before Catherine says a word, Chris is like, we've met before. So I guess the movie just decided that both girls are possessed by Pazuzu. The demon starts tormenting her and tries to convince her that Reagan's in hell and blah 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 blah. And then, I shit you not, mere minutes after Chris has just told us she is not an exorcist and cannot perform an exorcism, she tries to perform an exorcism. And the demon gives her the old fake out and makes her believe it worked, and then when she gets close enough, the demon grabs a cross and stabs her eyes out. So Chris McNeil spends the rest of the film blind in a hospital bed, just sending good vibes. In the next scene, Leslie Odom Jr. comes to visit her in the hospital, but obviously she can't see, so she's like, who are you? And then she goes off on this 5-minute monologue about the importance of faith, and all I could think was how funny it would be if Leslie Odom Jr. left at the beginning and she just kept talking. If I remember correctly, the scene after this was another long monologue about the importance of faith from Ann Dowd. It's genuinely hard to remember the scene order in this portion of the film, but I know at one point I turned to my friend and whispered, I feel like we just watched the same scene 3 times. So Leslie Odom Jr. and Catherine's parents and Ann Dowd and a couple other people go to the Catholic Church to try to get an exorcism, but they refuse. Probably because the most compelling piece of evidence they have of demonic possession is the help me thing, but since that exact same thing happened in Chris McNeil's memoir, which has presumably been out for a while, it's entirely plausible that the girls are faking and using the memoir as a blueprint. Or at least that's the point they would bring up in the original, but we are nowhere near that ballpark anymore, and we're not even playing the same fucking sport. So they just gather a bunch of people to give it their best shot, including the hoodoo root worker lady from earlier. It seems like they're trying to go for some sort of more modern interpretation where any faith works and not just the Catholic faith, but this is yet another shoehorned superficial change that doesn't actually engage with the original. If you're trying to take out the importance of Catholicism to The Exorcist, then you kind of need to make the entire movie about that. It feels like they're attempting an Avengers Assemble style approach to exorcism, just with different world religions, but literally everyone's a Catholic except the root worker and Leslie Odom Jr., who doesn't believe in God at all. But anyway, they screw these 2 chairs into the floor back to back and put the girls in them and tie them down. Everyone gets a little moment during the exorcism. The priest who's been forbidden from taking part has this triumphant moment where he comes in and he's like, I'm gonna do it, and then he immediately has his neck turned all the way around and he dies. Then we get to the climax. Essentially, the demon says that one girl can live while the other is going to die, and they have to make the choice of which one to save. And then you who have seen the original Exorcist remember Father Merrin saying, don't listen to a word it says, everything that comes out of its mouth is a lie. And thankfully Leslie Odom Jr. and Catherine's mom look at each other and they're like, yeah, we can't choose. Finally, a single brain cell has been used in this movie. And then, oh shit, it's time for a twist. So while the demon is tormenting Leslie Odom Jr. through Angela, it's like, oh, you don't believe. Wow, that's funny. And then we get a flashback to the opening of the film, and we learn that actually he didn't choose to save the baby. He chose to save his wife, but she died anyway. Which could have been a nice twist if it wasn't so obviously telegraphed in the opening by cutting right before he makes his decision. So the demon's like, you never chose me, you should choose me this time. And then what happens next is kind of impossible to follow. There's one of 2 things that happened, and I can't quite tell which it was supposed to be. Essentially, this entire scene, the girl's temperature has been like going up and they're basically about to like overheat and die, I guess. And by this point, I guess the exorcism has pretty much failed, and so they're about to die, and at this point, Catherine's dad is hiding in the other room and he shouts, I choose you, Catherine. And then we get the only cool sequence in the film where we get to see kind of where the girls are, which is just in this well, basically, and then you hear the demon's voice go, oh, I choose you, Catherine, and he pulls her underwater. So Catherine dies and Angela lives, but what's confusing about this sequence to me is that I don't really understand why Angela lives. At first, the implication seems to be that the demon's intention was to take whichever girl they chose to save and leave the other one alive, which I kinda like, even if it's incredibly obvious that that's the case. Like, if there's one person whose word you should not take at face value, it's probably a demon's. But what complicates this is that during this sequence, we see a flashback of Angela's mom getting her baby bump blessed in Haiti. So what are we meant to assume happened here? That the blessing protected her from the demon taking her, or that the demon wasn't trying to take her in the first place? Was anyone making a choice to save one of the girls enough for the demon to be able to take them both? Or was the demon only ever going to take the one that they chose to save? I genuinely have no idea, and I honestly don't think the movie does either. So after this incredibly sloppy climax, there's a scene of Anne Dowd talking to the police officer who was on the case when the girls were missing, and apropos of nothing, Anne Dowd says, "What do you think evil is?" And then I swear to fucking God, without even waiting for a response, she goes, "I'll tell you what I think it is," and immediately launches into yet another 5-minute monologue about the importance of faith. And for our final scene, we revisit Chris in the hospital, and another person comes to visit, and again she goes, "Who are you?" And then my heart sank one final time while watching this film as Linda Blair stepped into frame, and I thought, Jesus, they roped you into this too. And that's the plot of The Exorcist Believer. On a technical level, this film was mostly competent, with the exception of some dreadful looking CGI in the final act. Leslie Odom Jr. is fine in the lead role, but he really has nothing to work with, as most of what his character does is just stare at people while they tell him things. The performances from the possessed girls are no Linda Blair from the original, but they are good. And I did quite like the makeup choices for the possession. I really like the kind of swollen facial features, but what really took me out of the experience was that very frequently the dubbing of the demonic voice does not match up with their lips, and the kind of stuff that the demon says to fuck with people is nowhere near as shocking or boundary pushing as what came out of Reagan's mouth 50 years ago. All of this film's attempts to scare you are embarrassing, and goddamn what they did to Ellen Burstyn's character is even worse than what they did to Sally Hardesty in the Texas Chainsaw movie from last year. It may not be the worst shot, but from a story and script perspective, Exorcist Believer is the worst of the recent slate of remakes and requels of older horror films. Halloween Ends was terrible, but at least it didn't shit all over the original. The new Scream movies are painfully average, but there's qualities that I admire about them. And I have no fucking clue what they were thinking with that Texas Chainsaw film, but at least it was entertaining. The Exorcist Believer is many, many things, but worst of all, it's boring. It may sound like a fun, so bad it's good movie when you listen to a 15-minute recap of all the dumbest things about it, but actually sitting through the 2 hours of this film is a chore. This is just a fucking awful film that I can't even recommend, ironically, and God, I hope the failure of this one puts a nail in the coffin to this reboot trilogy. I'm gonna give The Exorcist Believer a 2 out of 10. I originally planned on talking about Anatomy of a Fall in this video as well, but I didn't realize how long the Exorcist review would be, so I'm gonna cap it there for today, and next time I'll talk about Anatomy of a Fall, May, December, and Dream Scenario. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Carmilla du Maurier, the composer next door, and I will see you in hell.